Has the Supreme Court of India just curbed the right to protest of Indian citizens? That's the question we're all going to have to be asking after a Supreme Court judgment which was delivered on Wednesday, 7th October. A very significant judgment which has held that protests can't occupy public roads and public spaces, that if you want to do that kind of thing, you've got to go to a designated area to do that. Now, this judgment was delivered by a bench of Justices Sanjay Kishan Kaul, Anuruddha Bose and Krishna Murari in a batch of petitions which had been filed earlier this year asking for moving the protesters at the Shaheen Bagh site to an alternative location because of the disruptions to the roads and the inconvenience being caused to commuters because of their protests there. Now, this was being heard by the court back in February this year. They had appointed a couple of interlocutors. They were trying to look at ways to resolve the whole thing. And then there was first the Delhi riots and then the pandemic. And then by 24th March, because of the lockdown measures, the protesters had to move and the Shaheen Bagh site was dismantled. Now, the court therefore has only come back to this matter now, and this judgment has now come out, which has held this stuff about the ability to protest in public spaces. Now, let's look at what the judges have said here. And I quote, "We make it unequivocally clear that public ways and public spaces cannot be occupied in such a manner and that too indefinitely. Democracy and dissent go hand in hand. But then the demonstrations expressing dissent have to be in designated places alone." So what the judges have said is that, it's the responsibility of the local administration to ensure that you don't have such an encroachment of public space. And I'm quoting here again, "We have no hesitation in concluding that such kind of occupation of public space, whether the site in question or anywhere else for protest, is not acceptable, and the administration ought to take action to keep areas clear of encroachments and obstructions." Now, this is an important point because they've said it's not just about the site in question, Shaheen Bagh, but anywhere else. Now, Shaheen Bagh was an inspiration for protests across the country, and there may be circumstances where one needs to have the ability to protest in a public space, make a large occupation of a public area, maybe even a road. But what the Supreme Court's judgment appears to be doing here is imposing a blanket ban on having any kind of large protest or any sort of protest in a public space. Now, the question is, how is this going to affect us going forward? Is this going to curb our right to protest in those places? Well, not necessarily, because if we look at the law, it may just be that the Supreme Court judgment can't really do what it's doing here. It can't really impose this blanket ban. Now, who could tell the Supreme Court that? Well, the Supreme Court itself. In 1972, a constitution bench of the Supreme Court in the Himmat Lal case had held that you can't have these kind of blanket bans, that while there are restrictions, that you can't have people protesting just pretty much anywhere, nevertheless, the state cannot by law abridge or take away the right of assembly by prohibiting assembly in a street or public place. The state can only make regulations in aid of the right of assembly of each citizen and can only impose reasonable restrictions in the interest of public order. Now, that's the key point. What they said in 1972 when it came to the right to protest on streets in public spaces was that you can only have restrictions which are there in the interest of public order. You can't, in a blanket way, take away this right. This is, in fact, even if we look at India's international law obligations, it's not just the Supreme Court. India's international law obligations say exactly the same thing, that you can't have a blanket ban on protests. In fact, under international law, the state is supposed to facilitate protests. Now, how do we kind of interpret this judgment, which is, as we said, it's a constitution bench judgment. That's 5 judges versus 3 in the Shaheen Bagh one. So, it takes precedent. It's binding on what the Supreme Court did here today. So how do we interpret them together? One way is to say that, look, the public order requirement means that that's a check on this new judgment in the Shaheen Bagh case, that until and unless there's a real threat to public order, the new this new verdict by the Supreme Court will not come into play. Now, public order can't just be a disruption of traffic. There has to be an actual sort of threat of violence. There has to be a danger to the state. Like, it's something quite serious. It's been held in a long line of Supreme Court judgments, including most recently in the Anuradha Bhasin judgment on the Jammu and Kashmir restrictions back in January. And there they said that you have to have clear material to make that claim. You can't just the government can't just make that claim on its own. Another way of perhaps trying to harmoniously interpret this is by saying that the Supreme Court judgment in the Shaheen Bagh case only applies to a protest of that level, which is sort of occupying such a large space, and one which has lasted for so long, because the court specifically pointed out that because of the lapse in time, they had to step in. Now, again, that's still a bit tricky because the wording doesn't quite make that clear. So while you might be able to try and make this argument on law and say that legally speaking, it can't be a blanket restriction, the police and the authorities are likely to interpret it like that. Now, we've seen this already before. Delhi, for instance, you might have heard that you can only protest at Jantar Mantar and Ramlila Maidan. But that's not actually the case. You're actually allowed to protest elsewhere, even in central Delhi, as long as you get permission. And that was something the Supreme Court confirmed in 2018. And yet, the police and the authorities completely sort of ignore that. And they said that you can only protest in Jantar Mantar and Ramlila Maidan. You cannot protest anywhere else. So, while the law may be that you can't have this kind of blanket restriction, on the ground, protests might find themselves curbed like this. You might be hoping that you can make the argument that it has to be such a large one, it has to be a sustained one for many days, months even, for the restrictions to apply. But again, that's not something which is going to be easy to convince the police or the authorities. So the real solution here is going to be that protesters can obviously try their luck, but the real solution is probably going to have to be to go back to the Supreme Court itself and get some clarity on this point. So till then, while on law the right to protest has not been curbed, in practice there might be a significant restriction on our ability to protest in public spaces until and unless the Supreme Court clarifies this whole issue.